welcome to the SquaMates podcast. This is a very serious podcast about reptiles and amphibians, and I am one of your four co-hosts. My name is Dr. Mark D. Schertz. I am the curator of herpetology at the Natural History Museum of Denmark, and I'm joined by my three lovely co-hosts, Ethan Kosak.
Hi, I'm Ethan. I'm an artist and illustrator, and I keep a bunch of animals in my house.
And Hiral Naik, Dr. Hiral Naik. Dr. Hiral Naik!
Yeah. Hey.
Hi, I'm Hiral, snake ecologist and conservationist from South Africa.
And Gabriel Lughetto.
And I'm Gabriel Lughetto. I'm a paleo artist, concept artist, scientific illustrator, and I used to work in herpetology, but not anymore.
Fantastic. Now, we are gathered here today to talk about some of everybody's favorite lizards, except for Gabriel. Today, we're actually going into a requested topic. So back around the time of recording of episode 32 of this show, we received a request from a user called Addison Car Camo 911 on Instagram, asking us to talk about bearded dragons. It just so happens that we know a little bit about bearded dragons, and we're very happy to talk about it. So we're going to get into it.
And I'm going to sleep during the whole episode when we talk about the most boring lizards ever.
I mean, yeah.
Now.
Yeah. Now, Ethan is about to pull one out like it's a samurai sword. Strong. Amazing. If you're not watching the show over at youtube.com/@SquaMatesPod, you should, because that was a pretty brilliant moment just there. Yes, excellent cover image there, Ethan. Absolutely love it. We have a guest on the show. Ethan, what's her name?
This is Sleestack. She's probably close to almost 10 years old. She's not the biggest dragon, but she's ours. She's just a standard issue wild type bearded dragon.
Beautiful. We'll get into all the genetics of the beardies later on.
Yeah.
Wicked.
And hopefully she doesn't crap on me while we're talking. So.
Yeah, that would be good.
Just added spice for the show. If you notice a weird cut in the show, you now know why.
You'll know why. Yeah.
Yeah, we can get into all of those juicy bits in a bit. But let's maybe start off with kind of a general, like, setting the scene, right? So, what is or a bearded dragon? ? Right? So, just for those of you who are not in the know, bearded dragons, it's kind of in the name. The dragon lizards is kind of a colloquial name for the family Agamidae. And the agamids are this group of acrodont lizards. You're familiar with another group of acrodont lizards by the name of Chameleonidae, the chameleons. So chameleons and agamids are sister to one another. Agamids are moderately widespread across the world, especially in Africa, Asia, and then they have their real kind of strength of diversity in Australasia, where there's a huge amount of diversity, especially at the subfamily level. So there's a lot of stuff going on across these things. And if you zoom in to one particular clade down there within the, what is it? Is it Draconinae? I can't remember which subfamily it is.
I think it is.
Yeah, Draconinae, we have this clade of a few different kinds of dragons. We have Rankin's dragons, which are kind of, I guess, relatively small, basically look like bearded dragons, but small.
Do you like, right, I have that in my notes, bearded dragon, but small.
Bearded dragon, but small.
And yet we also have Pogona minor and...
Yes, exactly. We also have small, so the bearded dragons refers specifically to this genus Pogona, which is one clade within this group. And then there's also... they're quite closely related to the earless dragons, the Tympanocryptis species, and then there are these, what are they called? Tree dragons, the Diporophora. And they're, I think that's right? Sorry. Diporophora are kind of terrestrial, long-legged dragon things. They're called they have a few different names in there, but they are all moderately closely related to the tree dragons, which is Amphibolurus, which are also Australian. So this is all a kind of an Australian radiation that we have going on in here. And so, Pogona exclusively found in Australia, moderately widespread across Australia, and going actually pretty far out into the outback in terms of their habitat. I'm sure we'll get into that. It's a very important topic in terms of the pet trade. And then, I mean, that's the main reason we're talking about them today, is because they are so phenomenally popular in the pet trade.
Yeah, so when I was pulling together some research for this, one of the things that I came across was like people doing Google Trends studies to kind of study the popularity of reptiles over the last, I think they studied over the last like 25-ish years. And bearded dragons are maybe the most popular lizard globally. And the only one that is probably more on the rise would be crested geckos, Corelliphus.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's been this huge shift in terms of the pet trade in the last, I would say, especially in the last 15 years. You've really noticed it used to be when you'd go to expos and shows and trading fairs. Like it used to be that bearded dragons were absolutely dominant. The other one that was kind of comparable with them was leopard geckos, and quite quickly after Corallophus started getting established, these are the cresties. They really expanded onto the market and totally started to dominate in that field. And so you saw a decline, I think, at the same time of leopard geckos. And bearded dragons have kind of held their own in a way, but partly that's, I guess.
I think when we circle, let's circle back around to we don't have to go in depth into care, but I do want to talk about the space needed.
Yeah, it's so important in the context of all that thing.
Yeah,
the accessibility of these animals is part of the reason that they are as popular as they are. So maybe let's get into that.
Yeah. Do we want to talk first? Because you started to say, what is a bearded dragon?
Yeah.
And so there are
a bit of a basic description, and maybe also we can talk a little bit about the species diversity, right?
I was going to say there are currently, I think, 6 recognized species.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'll look it up on the side while you talk.
Yeah. Okay. So Pogona vitticeps is the one that we're all familiar with and that we're going to be focusing on today, and that is your central or inland bearded dragon. There are also, as far as what's in the hobby, there were at one time Pogona barbata, is it? Barbata. Eastern beardeds.
Yes.
Which are
much
bigger
nicer
and darker and scarier
which
looking.
are also the largest, I believe, of the Pogona species, right? So I actually have one. I have one here from the collection. It's a very big, this is a wild specimen that was caught back in 1953 between Adelaide and Melbourne. And it's a pretty hefty individual. Looking at it, I think this is a male. But yeah, that's a very, very big agament. I mean, some agaments are absolutely enormous, right? So we're not talking about the size of like sailfin lizards or anything, but it's a hefty lizard. They're very strongly built, quite wide, and famous for their kind of pancake ability, as it were.
Yeah, and they do. Well, we'll get into behavior in a second. I want to cover just the other ones. I've never heard of some of these. I've never heard of Pogona nullarbor or until yesterday Pogona minor, which is another dwarf beardy.
Yes, exactly. So I got one of those as well. This is Pogona minor here from, it says on the label, New Holland. So this specimen was collected in 1867.
That looks
big. That place New Holland probably is not called New Holland.
No, I believe that place New Holland is now called Australia. So it may not be a particularly informative information. It might be restrictable to a specific location, but yes, this was collected by Günther. I'm not sure which Günther, but yes.
Because that's such a uncommon name in Germany. Nobody heard of a Gunther before.
I was going to say it's interesting that Pogona minor there looks bigger than the living Pogona Henry Lawsoni that I've seen.
Yes.
So
Henry Lawsoni are really tiny. Just because they're smaller, like it has a small name. Pogona minor was described in 1919, but Henry Lawsoni was described in 1985. So it might have been that they thought, oh, minor, this is small relative to the other one that was described at the time, which was mostly vitticeps and barbata. And so, by comparison, it was minor. But then Henry Lawsoni is, I think, the smallest of the available.
So one of those that you wish they would have picked a different name.
It's a mess. Yeah.
You could have done better than naming it after Henry Lawson.
Yes,
a poet.
Yes.
A poet, I believe.
That's a horrendous.
I mean, there are worse things, I guess.
Yeah.
Debatable. No, I'm joking. I'm just gonna be the hater the whole episode.
Wikipedia describes Henry Lawson as an Australian writer and bush poet. One of often called Australia's greatest short story writer. He's one of the best known Australian poets and fictions of the colonial period. So that could be quite informative. Yes. I won't go into the other details of his Wikipedia page, but it's not necessarily the best thing in the world.
As usual, which is the case for not
what a surprise.
Things about exactly. When you read colonial period, that usually says it all.
Yeah. So Pogona vitticeps, described in 1926.
By this guy called Ernst Ahl. And Ahl is, I think we probably talked about Ahl before on the show, actually. He was the curator for reptiles and fishes at the Natural History Museum in Berlin, Museum für Naturkunde. And he was a raging Nazi. And not only was he a Nazi, which is obviously horrible, abhorrent, but also he was one of the worst taxonomists of all time. He described a lot of species without reading the literature or having access to the literature. And so he basically assumed that a lot of the things that he was describing were valid species. And so he just wrote loads and loads. He was extremely productive. Produced loads and loads of papers. Exactly. Everything is new if you describe it that way. But the worst thing is he was so early in doing that he was right half of the time. Unfortunately, he was wrong half of the time as well. But that means that many of Ahl's names have kind of stuck, and this is true in reptiles, amphibians, and fishes. And so, he's got something of a reputation for being kind of an early example of a hoser type taxonomic vandal, simply not doing due diligence and naming loads of shit. And the other thing that he did was create total chaos in the collection in Berlin. He would often pick up jars and then put them back somewhere else, and you'd never see them again. And also, he put a lot of names on jars for species that he planned to name, but that were never published. And so you have what are called label types. You have species where it looks like this is a species that has been described on the label in the jar, but that there is no publication tied to that name.
I mean, Mark, we could have just stopped at he was a Nazi.
Yeah, I mean, obviously these are very different classes of incredibly horrible things. Like he volunteered to go and fight for the Nazi side and things, and I think later died in a prisoner of war camp in the Czech Republic.
Listen,
I believe.
Ethan Pogona is just leaving. She just don't want to hear about this.
Like all this Nazi bullshit.
I'm done.
Get out of here. Yeah.
Not only was he an abhorrent human, he was also a bad taxonomist. And obviously that's nowhere near as bad a thing, but still it causes problems for centuries later, which is a serious annoyance. So that's my 15 Pfennig about Ernst Ahl.
So I was going to. That's great. I think where to go from here is probably to talk a little bit about the timeline.
Can only go up.
the
Thank you. Yes, a
timeline of
palate
how.
cleanser after that.
Yeah, we need a palate cleanser. I
It's
want to talk
true.
about. So they are a bearded dragon, vitticeps. The central bearded dragon is we're saying probably one of the most popular lizards in the pet trade. And how did it get to the United States from Australia when Australia has not allowed the exportation of its wildlife for a number of years? This
Quite
is where I'm-
famous for being very, very strict about export of animals.
right. So if you look online, there are a number of sources that will tell you that that Australia has not allowed exports since the 1960s. However, the only solid law I could find, the earliest was 1982, where they banned all vertebrates, all native vertebrates. So, um, although there are exceptions you can get if they're microchipped and stuff like that, but like I think what we're seeing here was like there was sort of a looser collection of rules and regulations prior to 1982, and then in 1982 you had a like ironclad nothing
Right.
is getting out.
Right.
But somehow we have in the 90s these lizards making their way to the US, and it looks like they made their way to the US through Germany.
Not an
Because-
unusual route for a lot of things very popular in the pet trade.
Yeah. There's one of the biggest reptile shows in Europe happens in Germany. We've talked about it before on the show.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But not only that, but Germany shares borders with countries that do not very strictly control imports. So although Germany itself is quite strict about what can and cannot come in, its borders and the countries that are bordering on its, like on the countries that border its borders, have less strict policies. And so we, like, in many cases, the real reason, like the real thing that is kind of influential is the free transport across Europe when other things are entering, east of Germany and coming and making it in. I have heard stories about the Czech Republic in this regard, but I don't know, I don't know enough to point any fingers in any direction. I'm just saying.
I want to say that too. Like, I'm going to present this information with the caveat that smugglers don't write things down. So
no, exactly. Yes,
so
and much of it is hearsay, and so what would probably be very revealing if one had the time and the energy, and I'm sure that there are many people who are deeply interested in this history who have the knowledge and the literature available to them. I think that many of these stories are recorded in published magazines, not in the scientific literature, maybe not in the blog space, but many of them may be recorded in, for instance, Reptilia magazine, in the German Herpetofauna or whatever it's called magazine. These ones that are, in many cases, not digitized, not digitally available today, that are very hard to mine for information, but have this incredibly deep reference text if you have access to backdated issues.
We should say too, there was this like explosion of that kind of media in the late 80s, early 90s, going up into probably almost to the 2000s. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. Like print media for reptile, like magazine type stuff, I'm sure there's a lot of information there that we don't necessarily have access to.
Yes. This one time I hung out with a smuggler. Those types of stories have historically been actually quite popular. So I think that you can find access to them, no names named. But it does not take long. And without even trying, it's quite easy to have conversations with people where they talk about their experience of talking with someone who was like, either was a smuggler or was directly involved in smuggling or has like an accomplice who was a smuggler. So like these stories are known and you can hear about them in the
I mean I met that realm. So that story about the dragons being smuggled to Germany and then from Germany to the U.S. That's on Exoterra's website. Exoterra is like one of the major brands of reptile supplies companies
Yep.
in the U.S. So like it's not a secret. It's
No,
not,
exactly.
you know.
And I mean, the other there are two very, like, I would say, commercially important species that come to mind that share similar histories, that are at the moment kind of getting popular in this regard. Lanthanotus, the earless monitors, have a
Oh
very
yeah.
similar story, but much more recent. Because allegedly, from what I've heard, no Lanthanotus has ever left Borneo legally, and yet they are very well established in the pet trade, and are
Really? I didn't
increasingly
know.
available. They're
Yeah.
super easy to breed, apparently, if you know what you're doing, which is very exciting because they're incredible animals. But what I've heard is that no one of them has ever been legally exported. I don't know if that's true, so please don't take that as the gospel truth. But that is what I've heard. And the other one is Chinese or Japanese. One of the giant salamanders, that are likewise have never been legally brought outside of the zoo trade.
They are also farmed for food.
They
in
are
some
farmed
places.
for food, exactly.
Yeah.
And some of those animals are. Total digression. I saw a horrible AI narrated video the other day showing one of the breeding centers where they farm the giant
Oh.
salamanders, and it showed their egg chains.
Yeah.
My mind was blown. They are so cool.
Yeah.
The biggest forbidden boba you've ever seen. I mean,
So I was just saying, so that yeah, the story of how they got here is well known as far as most places here in the U.S. acknowledge the fact that they did not get here super legally, and that's probably true of other Australian species as well. There is also some porousness with like Indonesia, because sometimes you have certain animals that are Australian that are in Indonesia. Like I think of White's tree frogs, Litoria species. There is an Australian strain, but there is also an Indonesian strain.
yeah.
of
And I think,
them.
for instance, Lialis burtoni, the legless
Yep.
gecko, is from, like, most commonly known from Australia, but the specimens in the pet trade are probably from New Guinea, where it also
Guinea.
occurs.
Yes,
So they,
yeah.
although getting things out of New Guinea legally is also probably not really possible, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you see this. It's happened with blue-tongued skinks. It's happened with and I'm sure part of what it is that they'll say, "Oh yeah, it's from Halmahera," and then claim it's from one place, and then actually it's from the place you're smuggling out of.
Right. But it quite quickly became, for bearded dragons, became irrelevant for a number of reasons. I mean, not irrelevant in terms of the early origins,
Right.
but in the same way that Lanthanotus now can be traded, to my understanding, largely
Yes.
legally, even though they might ancestrally have been brought out illegally.
Yes.
That there is a legalization process, in spite of the fact that they are CITES protected. There's this legalization process that the descendants no longer suffer from the crimes of the originals, and so they basically become established. And Pogona vitticeps,
cats out of the bag.
Yes, exactly. At that point, the damage is done. Not that I think that there is a good legal framework for that. There probably isn't, but they got established super fast in the pet trade. And then, they went from Germany then to the US.
Yes. And then I wanted to mention, because in doing this research, and again I mentioned Exoterra, even so they credit Robert Malou of Sandfire Dragon Ranch being the U.S. breeder who was the first to like breed them at scale and create a lot of the morphs that they're famous for. So in researching this, I found out he passed away in 2023. So just recently. But I've had conversations with him on Facebook, and he's a very nice guy. And so once they were here, they got to some good people who were doing very interesting things
That
with
makes
them.
it doesn't that just make or break the survival of the species in the pet trade? I mean, we see
Right.
this constantly. I mostly pay attention for chameleons,
Right.
but you see that these animals that are exported usually under bad conditions, they wind up with an importer who really doesn't know what they're doing with them, and that importer will frequently pass them on to the highest bidder or to whoever wants them, and thinks that they can deal with them. And then I would say the vast majority of the animals that come in that way are dying because they're winding up the wrong hands. We get constant questions from people who are like, "Can you tell me which species of Columba this is?" And I'm just like, if you don't know what species it is, maybe you're not the person to be handling it. And unfortunately, most importers don't have that because they're not in it for that business. But that's why it's so important that there are connections between really good breeders and the importers, because they can kit things.
I mean, I think despite the legal gray area that Beardy's started out, they are a poster child for
Yes.
what the pet industry can, what a good thing that could be, as far as not taking these animals out of the wild and establishing them, and
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's so important, right? There is no fresh genetics coming in for bearded dragons, but because the population is so big, it's not exactly vital for them, and so
Right.
there is zero pressure on. Well, I hope close to zero pressure on wild bearded dragon populations to replenish the genetics, because there is just such an enormous population captivity. They're very well established, and then it's gotten to the point where people are doing designer things, where they're really messing around with the genetics. I should comment from the European side. Maybe we'll get into the morphs later, but I just
we can talk about let's talk a little bit about the morphs.
Yeah. So maybe to preface that, bearded dragons are very spiny scaled lizards, right? They have got these rows of scales. They've got rows of scales along the flank. They've got this massive chin thing of spiny scales. They've got spines on the back of the head and things. And of course, they are a mottling of different colors. They're not just uniform color. They have all kinds of colors, and that provides plenty of substrate for all kinds of different innovative breeding projects, where people are picking out on one thing and then inbreeding the hell out of them, usually in order to highlight those features. And we've seen the same thing in corn snakes, of course, probably the poster child for this in any lizard that gets to this level of popularity. We see it in Coralophus today. We see it in corn snakes. We see it in ball pythons. We see it. So there's
leopard geckos.
Was the next.
What's fascinating to me is that the time spans involved here are not very long.
No,
right?
It goes
when I was a kid, it was corn snakes and leopard geckos were the big deal, and now it's arguably it's crested geckos, but somewhere in between.
I would say crested gecko genetics are maybe not the most exciting thing. You don't we see some pretty stark contrast, but we don't see the level of extremes that I think you see in the bearded dragons. And I can think of a few reasons for that, right? Crested geckos are diplodactylid geckos. They don't lay a lot of eggs at once. Bearded dragons, clutch size is 30 eggs. 10 to 30 eggs, probably, depending on the calcium that you give to your female and how well you feed her and whatever. And so, the number of individuals that you have, you can select really, really, really strongly, very quickly in something that produces a lot of offspring. And not.
But if that was entirely the reason, I don't think you would have leopard geckos taking off the way that.
No, that's true. That's definitely true. It's also going to be something to do with the genetics, how complex they are, how easy they are to actually get to breed, their maturation times.
I was going to say, I think one of the things that has stymied crested gecko breeders a bit is that they haven't quite mapped out the genetics the way that they were able to for leopard geckos, where we know, I think that has to do with the fact that crested geckos are naturally polymorphic, so they already came in a wide range of styles.
Yeah.
And so I think that it was harder for them to map that stuff out. That's why
It
you
might also
don't.
be related to like founders' population size. I don't know how big they were, but that can have a major impact on your ability to like pull
Right.
specific
I think
genetics. And
I think they only ever got 200 founder
yeah,
animals
it
out
was a
of
small number.
yeah.
But I
Yeah.
mean, bearded dragons probably went through a similar, very very tight thing. What we've seen in ball pythons more than in the others that we've been talking about is this real attempt to get fresh genetics from the wild. Like people are actively searching to try and bring more
Yeah.
variation into ball pythons. And maybe, I mean, my like spur of the moment hypothesis there is that people are missing the cash cow that ball pythons were 20 years ago.
Oh yeah.
When I think back to 20 years ago and the first time I ever saw piebald ball pythons and I saw the $18,000 price tag on them, and now you can't sell them for more than $200.
Yep.
That is a hell of a loss for anyone who was investing at that. I mean, maybe at the time it made sense if you were in the right moment, but if you got in too late, the depreciation was super fast for
I'll
that.
tell you, it literally
genetics.
happens. I've watched it happen over and over again in the reptile industry. I mean, I'm a person who has vended at reptile shows, and uh, that cycle of boom
Yeah.
and bust,
It's brutal.
that is what you're signing up for when you do this. So, yeah, I don't care. I don't care for that.
But so going back to bearded dragons and their kind of the
Yeah.
diversity of morphs that we do see, I think like the ones that have stood out to me that I've really noticed are these color morphs. They're very orange individuals. There are almost black individuals. There's a lot of people playing with the genes that are coding apparently for spininess. So you have these, I think they're called silkies, right? The totally smooth bearded dragons that have lost the ability to produce the spines.
I want to come back to them in a second. There are yes. So they have played with morphs that play with the shape of the conicalness of the scale.
Mm-hmm.
And so some of them, yeah, I have it here. I have a link to it here. Hold on.
So there's, I mean,
you've got
how those scales are made is a developmental process. I can tell you that the bearded dragons hatch with those scales already there, and anything that is like that is ripe for messing around with the development of the animals.
It's the Dunner dragon. It's the Dunner morph that have the conical scales. And they're perfectly circular rather than oval shaped. So,
wow.
And from this breeder here, this that I pulled up, they are saying that they also have larger feet and longer toes. So it's interesting that would have an effect on.
Yeah, I mean, when you're playing with genetics like this, there's often a pleiotropic effect. There's this broader scale effect of if you mess with the genetics of one thing, often it's either that gene that's regulating those things is also involved in some other developmental process, or it's that the area around that gene, which is also being selected for, because you don't just get a single gene, you get everything that around it, that might have genes that are relevant for other developmental processes. And so you wind up with these kinds of selective sweeps.
Do we know if they're experiencing also like behavioral changes with these genetic modifications?
Yes. So the leatherback that you mentioned is basically the scaleless morph, and it kind of enhances the color. It doesn't have too bad of an effect on the animal. They could basically live a normal life. However, people have crossed leatherbacks to create what they call silkies or silkbacks, and
they are essentially truly scaleless.
Truly scaleless and susceptible to UV. You took a desert lizard and gave it the ability to get sunburns.
Oh my god!
Not great. Ethical wise, that's what, and that is, I will say, to the hobbyist side's credit, that is extremely frowned on nowadays. People
Yeah.
don't, unless you don't know what you're doing, people don't like generally intentionally make those the way they don't intentionally make like the lemon frost leopard geckos that all get cancer and die, or the spider ball pythons that
Yeah.
all have neurological problems. So this is a thing that happens with any kind of morph breeding, and I think it's partly because you're line breeding these animals, so this is what
Yeah.
happens.
Yeah. And I would just say what I was going to comment on before is we don't really see these kinds of morphs so commonly in the pet trade in mainland Europe, at least not at the shows that I've been at. Not that I pay a huge amount of attention to these breeds, but like I would say that we certainly see some color contrast things. I've never seen a silky dragon at a show that I've been to, and I don't know that I would have recognized many of the other ones. But I just by comparison, just thinking back, nothing like what we see for ball pythons or for corn snakes. Like those are still
I find that
much
deplorable.
greater
I
here.
really find that deplorable. I am really against it. Every time I see those, and I've even seen people posting pictures of scaleless pythons and scaleless bearded dragons. It's just
Definitely.
terrible.
Yeah.
It's almost like the pugs or something. Like it's unfortunately, I think this is a thing that human beings do and have done for thousands of years. Like we make koi and we made, it's just a thing that we do. But at the same time, like there is an ethical thing with this.
A major consideration, I think, from the perspective of a developmental biologist and an evolutionary biologist, it is awesome to understand the genetics of the transition from scales to no scales, because that is something that is essential to our own scaleless existence. And many of that, like we know, for instance, in temnospondyle and lepospondals, like some lineages with scales and some without, like the switches that are involved there is quite remarkable. And this does shed light a little bit on the genetics that are underlying those kinds of transitions, the evolutionary transitions. This is not something we should be playing with. Certainly it should not be played with for profit. So I would definitely say, like, we can learn a lot from it, but we should also be learning a lesson from it, which is don't do this. I feel the same way. Gabriel, I totally agree with you. I feel the same way when I look at pictures of these silky dragons as I do when I see those goldfish that can't swim properly because they're so round
it's
and
animal
their faces
abuse
bulging. Agreed. And I feel the same way about pugs. But that's yes.
No, I'm on the same page. I absolutely am. I think it's, well, like I said, why would you take a sun-loving animal and give it sunburns? Like,
yes. And not just sun-loving, sun requiring. These animals have such a demand for UV in order to be healthy that you now have to somehow administer the same effects of that UV in a way that doesn't cause them sunburn.
That's just I mean, and I should say too, I have no intention of ever being a bearded dragon breeder. I have one bearded dragon, but I don't see like a huge problem with someone making like a hypomelanistic animal or something, like something where it doesn't really affect the animal's ability to survive. But yeah, when you start getting into things that have actual quality of life impacts on the animal, it's your responsibility to stop that.
And there are, in some places there are ethics boards that oversee that, and in dogs there are ethics boards that oversee it, and that sometimes try to intervene and sometimes try to prevent intervention in some regards. But for instance, I am based here in Denmark, and Denmark has extremely strict laws on some dog breeds. And for instance, tail docking in Denmark and in Germany is either very, very frowned upon or actually illegal, depending on
Yeah.
conditions. So like there are practices associated with these things that are
Right.
So, but yeah, I mean, the fact that we've gotten so far is reflective also of the number of people who are involved and the way that they are doing these practices in terms
Right.
of their in terms of breeding here, and that I think also speaks to the fact that bearded dragons entered a space, and we've seen this again and again with the ultra popular reptiles in captivity. I don't think this has really ever happened with amphibians, although maybe white tree frogs. But they've entered that ultra popular phase where they're no longer specialist, hobbyist animals,
Right.
but they
Right.
are children's pets.
They are
And
sold
that-
at chain pet stores.
Exactly.
National
And some animals
chains.
that are sold at chain pet stores don't live long enough to then go on to be children's pets, like Yemen chameleons, are sold at many pet stores across. Like I've seen them in pet stores in the US when I've been visiting, and I'm
Every
just
pet
like,
store
that
has one.
animal,
Yeah, it's
that
gonna live
animal is
long
not going to
enough
survive.
I was going to say it's going to live long enough past the return policy.
Yeah, 30, 40 days maybe, and then and that's like, but these are animals that are establishing and are actually, people are keeping them at home and are breeding. My best friend and next door neighbor when I was a kid when I was a teen, got bearded dragons. He was not in any way associated
A
with
reptile
this whole
guy,
world. Not a reptile guy at all. He had a reptile guy for a friend, so maybe that was the reason. I had geckos at home, so maybe he was but yeah, he had 2 bearded dragons in his home, and it was accessible and relatively easy to care for. And what do they need? So the one thing that's important to know about agamids, many agamids are omnivorous. So the nice thing here is that you have an animal that doesn't just need meat. It can also doesn't just need insects. It can also eat fruit and vegetables, and that also again makes them more accessible. Off air, Ethan and I were talking about the requirements of some kinds of geckos. The reason that Corolophus ciliatus, the crested gecko, became so popular in the pet trade is because basically you can feed them dust, rapashi and similar products.
It's a commercially available powder
they are
mixed with water.
So accessible.
They don't even need heat in most people's homes.
Exactly.
So
now that's a difference. That's a major difference with bearded dragons. Bearded dragons are heat-loving lizards. They need heat. They need to be kept warm in order to do well in captivity, and they need a bit of space. They certainly need more space than a crested dragon. And I think that's possibly the reason we see them gaining so much popularity as a pet.
And UV also. Yeah. Although I would argue that unfortunately a lot of people don't properly provide them with either of those things.
And we see the consequences of that. We do see, it's not uncommon to see people being like, "What's wrong with my dragon?" And it has the worst case of scoliosis ever. Because
metabolic bone disease.
Bone disease, which is the same as scoliosis, which is a failure of the body to process vitamin D and produce bone appropriately, which is because of lack of UV.
Yeah, it's rough. It's really bad. I've seen some horror stuff. And I would say too, it's very common here to recommend that people, people often keep beardies in 40-gallon-ish enclosures. So 36 by 18 by 16. That's not enough space for a bearded dragon.
They're often very short enclosures too. And one thing that you see, so I have had a lot of interactions with people talking about best care practices for bearded dragons in the past. I have never kept bearded dragons myself, although I did take care of my friend's dragons when he was away. But a lot of it was boiling down to, what do we actually know about them in the wild and their ecology, and how can that inform our policies? We know that they go over large areas. We also know that they're very frequently photographed on trees and on tree stumps and in bushes and under bushes and things. And so there is this aspect of some opportunity for 3-dimensional movement is probably a good idea for your animal. It gives them opportunities for enrichment.
Yes.
And these
they like to perch. They like to
Yes.
I
sit-
thought they were like semi-arboreal at least.
yeah.
Yeah.
I would probably agree with that assessment. Like they have proper claws,
Yes.
and they can grab really, really well.
I have not trimmed her claws in quite a while, so I can show you what we're talking about. Actually,
Yeah. So these are lizards that have like really strongly recurved claws. They have no ability to retract them at all, and so they're very good at gripping. And there's like typical pictures you see, especially I think. Is it Barbados? I think you often see these photos of them sitting on top of fence posts. That they're like, this is how I survey my domain. And obviously, it's not the same thing as truly arboreal members of the Agamidae, but these are still lizards that are regularly climbing.
I would argue they're kind of marketed here as desert lizards.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And they're kind of always shown, like in the pet trade, as like living on sand and rocks.
Yes. Oh.
That's not how they are. That's not what they.
You have found my biggest pet peeve. I have so many. If you go back into the archives of my Tumblr, there are many questions that I've been asked about this, where I have opined at length about the care practices for these animals, because people keep them on sand. And they often keep them on what's called calcium sand, which is a product that was actually marketed at them. A terrible idea. Calcium sand causes impaction in these lizards. And agamids as a whole, much like most lizards, but agamids, I think, and Pogona in particular, lick the ground a lot as part of their sense perception. They are very intelligent, very active hunting, actively like exploring lizards. And the whole time they do it, they're like,
Yes.
And so they wind up ingesting a lot of that sand. It's always ingested. And so like probably the number one killer of agamids in captivity is impaction. And I think that relates to the fact that they're on sand. And if you go look up in situ photographs of Pogona vitticeps in the wild, have a count how many of them are on fine particulate sand.
Yeah.
They live on gravel and soil.
Yes.
And the same is true for leopard geckos, by the way.
Yeah.
Not
The same is true for
sand-living
most
lizards.
lizards, I would say.
Not skinkus. You can give them bath sand.
Are in sand.
Absolutely, yes. There
But
are a
even
few exceptions.
Kenyan sand boas get impaction from sand.
Yeah,
So
I believe that. Yeah, I mean, So there are other sand boas that are true sand dwellers, but many of these things actually want gravel basically as their substrate, and you can do better than that. Like if you can keep the plants alive, it's usually a good thing for the animals. And think about that.
We're not, to clarify too, we're not necessarily anti loose substrate, because that gets that gets
and
blamed.
they need it in order to breed, because they dig.
Yeah. And I'd argue they get a lot, even if you're not breeding them, they get a lot out of the ability to dig. They like to dig.
Definitely.
They like to dig she likes to dig little burrows, but not sand. Like
no.
Topsoil, or topsoil mixed with,
make a mix. That's always my recommendation. Is like get to the point where it feels right, to kind of what you've looked at and stuff. Yeah.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
As a South Floridian, I'm always surprised that such a ubiquitous animal in the pet trade has not been introduced anywhere. I don't think there's not a single place in the world where there's an introduced population of bearded dragon.
I don't know.
And I find that surprising.
Yeah.
That is surprising, and I don't know what it is, other than maybe they are almost semi-domesticated, in the sense that a lot of these guys can't like survive without human intervention. I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is. Like if we released bearded dragons into the American Southwest or something.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's part of the, like, where would they be able to survive in the wild?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. There are so many records from across the US.
Yeah, but none of them survive.
Exactly. But just looking at iNaturalist here, and I'm
Yeah,
just going to
yeah.
try and get a calculation.
There are plenty of records in South Florida, but they don't
Yeah,
survive.
plenty of records in South Florida. I
Of
have
course there
44
are.
observations across the U.S., continental U.S., and yeah, I mean, none of these are evidently juveniles,
Established.
which I would usually take as an indicator that these things are kind of established or breeding in situ.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yeah, good point. That's such a good point. I wonder if it's the humidity in South Florida specifically. Like what we usually see establishing, or what you usually see establishing in South Florida, are largely these tropical animals that are living in typically like subhumid climes. These are extremely not subhumid lizards. They are happy if there is a rain in the, like a little bit of mist in the morning, but like they don't need the closed forest or they don't live in the closed forest as we see in many of the other things that are introduced in South Florida, right? So like I'm thinking of chameleons and various snakes and various other lizards, the anoles and whatever that's established, the phelsuma that have established so well. Those are all subtropical and tropical lizards, but they're mostly in humid climes.
It's interesting that they're banned in Hawaii because they don't want.
Well,
but
Hawaii has been burned.
Yeah, but I was going to say I don't think they would survive in Hawaii.
No. Agreed. Although I maybe on some of the more volcanic islands that are more barren than elsewhere. And as you say, I think there is this potential for them to survive in various places. It would not surprise me if they could do pretty damn well in Namibia and other parts of southern Africa. Because
I was just going to say, because the western part of South Africa, I mean, it's probably ideal. Our climate's also fairly similar to Australia. I mean,
and when you think about the ecology as well, I mean, what you have in those areas are animals that are ecologically very, very similar. The sun gazers and the girdle lizards are really like cordyllids. Even some of the gyrosaurs are living in kind of similar ways in similar habitats.
But Hiral, you were telling us before we started recording that bearded dragons are also the most popular lizard pets in South Africa, right?
Yeah, I mean they're pretty common. I think I first saw my first bearded dragon in captivity, or probably at a pet store. I can't quite remember. But I mean they're pretty much everywhere, and it's legal to own. You don't need a permit, so pretty much.
And they haven't been introduced in South Africa either.
No. I mean, it would be really interesting to speak to people to find out if there's, examples of them. But I think that's the thing. If someone let one loose somewhere, we would never know.
Right.
Yeah. But I would imagine that if somebody left one loose, I mean, if they are so common in the pet trade, eventually several are going to get loose. That's going to happen. And that's how populations get established everywhere. I'm just surprised that for such a ubiquitous species, that is, my cat decided to have an opinion about it. Well, for such a ubiquitous species around the world, it hasn't been introduced anywhere. You could
almost make that case for leopard geckos too, though. Like,
yes, as well, and crested geckos as well. It's there are certain species that for some reason, even though they're super popular in the pet trade, they have not been introduced. Because I was thinking, for example, I'm sure that a lot of people in Spain have bearded dragons. I'm sure a lot of people in the Canary Island have bearded dragons. The Canary Island is volcanic, is dry, there's a lot of that kind of same habitat. They have not been introduced there. They have a lot of other introduced and reptiles, but not that one. So that is to me surprising.
All I can say is that a lot of the animals I've encountered, leopard geckos, bearded dragons, are extremely
domesticated.
Yes,
that's what I think.
I hesitate to use domesticated, but like I don't think this animal could survive without my intervention.
I agree. I think that's part of the issue.
And so it's I think that's part of it, because I think like unless I present her with the hornworm with tongs, she won't eat it.
Like, for example, your pet gets released in South Florida. We have so much stuff there that will eat it immediately.
Yes.
If you just like that.
Yes.
Yeah.
So not only can it not compete because it can't fend for itself because it doesn't know how to hunt properly, but also it will get eaten by other animals so fast because what a delicious animal. It has these false... everything about its defenses is fake. The spines on the body are so soft.
Yes.
They're totally soft. It puffs itself up. It stands up on its legs. It makes its beard big and black. And then you just are like, oh, yum. Because if that doesn't work where you are, because nobody's seen it before, it has zero effect.
They also have a tendency to be overweight in captivity.
Yeah, also true.
Because
fit
people,
creatures,
like I said, people tend to keep them in too small of an enclosure, and they tend to feed them more insects as adults than they need. They really, it's like, it should be like 80% vegetation, 20%.
And probably also really, and we see this across most animals in captivity, but really lacking that diversity of insects that would characterize a wild diet. And I think that this is probably, having never experienced them in the wild, I still think that if you were to go to the wild and observe these lizards in the wild, compare their behavior, compare how it is, how do they react to people, and then look at how you see them in captivity, it's one of the starkest contrasts that I can imagine, because they are really like domesticated to the point of...
That's what I was going to say. There is an element of domestication in this.
They've lost those natural behaviors in the same way that we see it in many of them.
I am sure that just like happening in dogs and other breeds, we have bred also for, being more calm and being, less aggressive, because all the pictures that I see from
it's
wild...
not normal for a lizard to sit on your shoulder for
and all the pictures that a lot of if you see, and I've seen bearded dragons in documentaries and stuff, they behave completely different. They are aggressive. They are making sure that they are displaying.
And they also tend to be much thinner. Like I mentioned the obesity thing, but like just a slimmer, sleeker looking animal,
much fitter. They do so much more exercise. I think you see the same thing in Coralophus, for instance. You go look at wild photos of Coralophus, and you see these like sleek, thin-bodied crested geckos, and then you look at the ones in captivity. They're like, they almost never have a tail. And then you look at the ones in captivity, and most of them are terribly overweight. And I really think it's this combination of the diet that's really not optimal, and then also like the amount of exercise that they're able to get. And you used to see the same thing in chameleons, but I think you're seeing that less and less and less, because the people in the chameleon hobby especially are really paying attention to these things and are getting much better. And chameleons, by their very nature, are cruise foragers, and they will move around the whole tank while they're looking for food. Whereas these things are extremely opportunistic, like, it moved, I have this theory that the harder an animal is to take care of, the better its community will be online. That's probably an accurate representation of things like the dart frog trade, especially. I think of, because like they're just awesome, and
conversely, the more
ass to take care of.
I was going to say, and conversely, the more common, ubiquitous and low maintenance the animal is,
well, it becomes more accessible to people who are only surface gleaning the accessibility of that creature, right? So they're not like, if you have to be a specialist to keep them, you can say the same thing of the plant community. The people who are keeping the crazy orchid species diversity and carnivorous plant species diversity, those people are like crazy dedicated. And then you go look at the Monstera community, and it's just like, so there's a big all of these communities have the same there's a trade-off between the accessibility and what I wanted to say was the other popular dragon from Australia, one that's also really increased in popularity recently, other than like obviously there are other Pogona. So Pogona Henry Lawsoni is also quite popular in captivity. But the other one that's getting quite a lot of traction recently is Chlamydosaura, a lizard I thought I would never see in captivity. Chlamydosaura are frilled lizards.
Yeah.
They are incredible lizards. The dream lizard for me, like 30 years ago. I could have, what an incredible creature. And then the other day I was in a pet store, and I was like, they've just got two, just sitting there. And
they're not as common as bearded dragons.
No, exactly. They are increasing.
I have never seen one in a pet store.
Oh, I have. My local shop definitely has them occasionally.
Really?
Yeah.
They tend to be significantly more expensive.
But it's early days.
Yeah.
And now is the moment to see it. I think that you'll see the same thing that we saw in bearded dragons, where the loss of many of those wild behaviors, more kind of a domestication. And the Chlamydosaura, because the behavior is so similar, ecology is actually quite similar as well. These are true tree lizards, Yes, yeah. You have to have a vertical tank for them, but are in many respects otherwise quite similar to Pogona. They are, dramatically increasing in popularity. And I recently saw somebody who was saying that they are also at beginner's level to take care of, presumably because Agame is quite smart as it goes for a lizard.
They are smart. I was going to say also, if you can provide for a bearded dragon, you can almost certainly provide for a frilled dragon. You just have to
exactly.
You just have to turn the enclosure up. But they're not. Right, they're basically the same care, and that's circling back to the Rankins dragons.
They get pretty big, though. They get much bigger than a. They get much bigger than a bearded dragon.
Well, my only concern with people who want to keep them has been that the main reason a lot of people like them is they do
and they're going to be stressing them out to do that.
Right,
all the time.
It shouldn't be doing that if it likes you. So. I mean, I don't handle, aside from this one, I don't handle most of my animals very often, so I don't think it would, but, yeah, I don't know. I think a lot of these Agame lizards are very similar in care, so if you can care for a bearded dragon, you probably care for most of these. I have in my notes here, because we were going to mention the Rankins dragons, that basically... it is exactly the same care as bearded dragons, just smaller. So, they're the ones that should be kept in the size enclosure that a lot of people buy for bearded dragons. They would be ideal in, in a 40-gallon or something like that. And I also would say that they are less territorially... you still shouldn't keep two males together, but you can keep a trio of, one male, two females together, and they won't die or overbreed or
So I should mention that right at the beginning I was talking about Rankin's dragons as sister to the rest of the Pogona. That's because there is Rankin's dragons, the common name that's also used for Pogona Henry Lawsoni, and then there is a genus called Rankinia with the species Rankinia diamensis, which can also be called Rankin's dragons, but is apparently better referred to as mountain heath dragon or mountain dragons from the southeast of Australia, and also found on Tasmania. But confusing terminology, because Henry Lawsoni does not contain Rankin in the name. So I don't know why it's
really
called
we should be calling them Lawson's dragons.
Lawson's dragons, yes, exactly. Or blacks, apparently black soil bearded dragons.
That's a better, please don't name more animals with patronyms, please.
What we mostly hear them called is dwarf bearded dragons because they are substantially smaller than vitticeps.
Well, I had heard, the rumor that I had heard was that they were, you could keep them in colonies. So I was like, oh, that's really cool. But when I went to research it a little bit more, other people were like, no, they will still fight with each other. And in talking to someone I know who has kept them, they were like, yeah, one of mine bit the leg off of one of the other ones. And,
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so these animals are always. Anytime you keep large numbers of animals together, you're likely to have some fights of some kind, squabbles of some kind, and especially if you feed them together, it can be quite problematic. So, unless they have proper social dynamics, and that would really surprise me for an agamid, then and probably best to keep them not in more than 2 or 3 individuals in a cage. That is very different for many of the skinks, for instance, that are truly social. Egernia being the classic example of highly social skinks.
Well, I mean, when it comes to vitticeps, you can't keep them together at all long term because they will just try to murder each other.
Or mate the whole time and produce huge numbers of eggs.
Yeah, that's bad too. Yeah.
So do you see the same kind of pressure on like if you keep a male and a female together long term, do we see the same pressure on them to like the females overproducing eggs and basically depleting their calcium stores?
It's true of almost every lizard I've ever kept. I generally, my policy is to not cohabitate anyone because that's what will happen,
Yeah. I think that's a good banner. Don't just avoid cohabitation as much as possible. There are many of the leaf-tailed geckos, for instance, will also people put them together to breed them and then separate them and keep them separately because otherwise the females will produce eggs until they die.
Yeah, that seems pretty normal in geckos. I don't think they're the only geckos I keep cohabed regularly are the lychees because they are different. They have some kind of monogamous pair bond thing going on where they sleep.
And Lepidodactylus, you could do it too, but that's because it's all females.
Yeah, I think that we know so little about the behavior and the natural history of so many species that I would take all this conversation with a big grain of salt until we know more about a lot of species.
Yes. So just to end on behaviors, the beardies do have, I know you're a hater, they do have some pretty interesting behaviors. Watch, she's going to shit on me right when I say that.
There she goes.
Yeah. So, they do the head bobbing and they do arm waving for submission. So it's interesting because you can really see them sort of talking to each other. You don't necessarily get that with a lot of other reptiles in kept. I don't know. They're a good gateway drug lizard for a lot of people, and I think that there's something to be said for that. And they do have some interesting behaviors, I think.
Yeah. Oh, I totally agree. I think they are in terms of. I keep talking about intelligence. Obviously, we are long overdue for having a proper person who knows something about SquaMate cognition to come on and talk to us about this stuff. But I do think that they are very curious animals, and they exhibit quite a lot of social cues, certainly more obviously than many of the other lizards we're familiar with, right? So geckos are often very mostly conflict-driven cues, whereas there's a lot of this social positioning that these lizards are doing, the hand waving thing, the head bobbing thing, that is really obvious among agamids, especially. That is very, very pronounced in these things. Obviously, you see many of those behaviors in other lizards as well.
I have a lot of lizards. I don't have too many lizards who will sit there with me like this and take an interest in what I'm doing and, interact with me in a way that is more mammal-like than most lizards. So there's something, we've talked before about the study that was done with beardies where they had observational learning. There are, there's more going on with them, I think, than nothing.
Although sometimes it is nobody's home. Yeah, when they spend hours trying to dig through one corner of a tank, for instance.
Like I said, they may not be up to snuff as far as surviving in the wild, but they're certainly, as pets, a lot more. arguably semi-domesticated animals, and they seem to get something out of handling an interaction in a way that a lot of the lizards I have don't.
I think that the term. Sorry, Hiral, go ahead.
But I think that's what makes them so good when it comes to for educational purposes. I mean,
yes,
with the reptile center here in Hoedspruit, we had one. I think they still have one, but we've used it for our education, especially with rural communities. You can't really do that with most other lizards. Like they're very shy, or they won't put up the displays. And I think it's so important to be able to show people how an animal actually behaves, which I think is really cool. And I think when it comes to the education, the information about them is not told enough. And I think that's where some work kind of needs to be done.
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, it does make them really excellent outreach tools. And I think there are few zoos and collections globally that don't have as part of their outreach reptiles a bearded dragon, because they are very approachable. You can hand one to a child and not be worried about it getting hurt, and that's not the same for many other animals. So yeah, that it does kind of lower the barrier, which is quite good. And then, I mean, the other side of bearded dragons, at the opposite end of the scale, is that they've actually become quite well established as a model system in developmental and evolutionary biology for reptiles, because they lay big clutches. They're fairly easy to raise, and so they are one of the better model systems. I think we might even have talked about the genome in a previous episode of the show when it was published. So I think that, good resources.
I was going to say that I think the term domestication applies to them. I mean, we have changed their genetics. We have changed the behavior to a certain degree. I don't see why the term domestication doesn't apply to them when it applies to corn or all the stuff.
Sure,
I think it's totally applicable to it.
But would you say the same thing of a ball python?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, then fair.
Yeah. I would say the same thing about a lot of about the crested geckos to a certain degree, and we know so little of the behavior. This is why we need a behavior, like somebody that works on reptile cognition and stuff, because we know almost nothing of the behavior of these animals in the wild. So we really have not that much of a tool to gauge how much we have changed their behavior through the genetic changes that we've done through domestication. You know what I mean? So I think that the term is totally applicable to them. And because they are domesticated, I find them super boring.
But how would you feel about them in the wild? I mean, would you?
I think that in the wild, I would love to see them. I just don't like them. I just find them uninteresting, the domesticated versions of them. But I would love to see one in the wild. And like a Pogona barbata looks amazing every time I see a photo displaying. I would love to see. I generally am I love reptiles a lot more in nature than in terrariums, as a general rule for me.
Sure. But I would just argue from the advocacy perspective, having an animal that is like this, that still, even in its domesticated form, exhibits many of the typical behaviors of a reptile, having it accessible, having them affordable, and having the care relatively accessible as well, means that we have one of the best gateway drugs.
Yeah, for sure. No, I agree.
Get little kids involved in herpetology.
For sure, I totally agree with that.
When I'm talking with people in the general public, and they're like, "Oh, I know somebody who has a reptile at home," the chances are that reptile is either a ball python or a corn snake, or a bearded dragon, or one of the two geckos, right? So there's this. As such, they have that really important role where I agree, watching one all day would not be the first thing that I'd like to do with my time. But I think that they have an incredibly important role to play as kind of ambassadors for the reptile world. Great animal to get people over their phobia.
Yeah,
You know
yeah,
what?
no, and exposing kids particularly to reptiles and making them understand is super important. I think that's what Hiral was also saying earlier. That I think is extremely important. I was just talking from a personal point of view, but I completely agree. I couldn't agree more with it.
I think and we can kind of wrap up after this, but I think what's kind of interesting with a lot of the reptiles that have become super popular, established pets, is that a lot of it is an accident of circumstance.
Totally.
What reason did we land on having the central bearded dragon over,
Barbara?
Barbara or Rank? Like it's why that one? We can't really tell you.
I think there might be. I mean, what an interesting question. I think there might actually be a way to predict suitability of a species to establishment at the pet trade at this scale. I don't think that anybody in the world would have chosen crested geckos as one of those species. They're so unlikely, especially at the way that they got established. It was so unbelievably unlikely because
they were
basically
thought to be extinct,
and then suddenly they were like the world's most populous lizard.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Insane. Absolutely mind-bogglingly insane. But I do think that there is a predictability here because there are various different aspects.
One of them has to be genetic, like plasticity, right? Like the ability for people to come in and muck around with their colors, and
So the reason I'm so happy to opine on this is that I'm deeply disinterested in doing the study myself. So if anybody wants to do the study, please in your acknowledgements acknowledge the SquaMates podcast and put on a comment. But genuinely, I think this is so simple to break it down, and you could do it as a proper study because basically the animals need to be coded in terms of their thermal tolerance and suitability to keeping in temperate households, because the vast majority of pet keepers are in temperate or subtropical climes. So we're talking about mostly the United States, Europe, South Africa, and various parts of Asia. Not as much going on in South America, as far as I understand. And in Australia, it's fine to keep Australian animals, but illegal to keep anything else.
Which is one of the reasons that the beardies are so popular in Australia.
Right, exactly. So in terms of global popularity, it boils down so simply. So there's thermal tolerance, a very important thing, and their ability to tolerate relatively stable European household temperatures or slightly above. Getting below, very hard to deal with, and that's why animals like the montane bearded dragons and other montane animals are so difficult to. I was going to say geckos. The ones that are living up in the mountains are really, really hard to establish in captivity because you need low temperatures.
It's also why axolotls are such a pain for people because they need to be at 65 Fahrenheit most of the time.
Right.
And I'm just gonna point out that I think in a lot of places in South America it is legal to keep native animals, but it's illegal to keep foreign.
Right.
Whereas here in New York,
in the cowboy
illegal,
country, yes, exactly. Right. So if we other than thermal thing, there's obviously the humidity thing. Having animals that barely need any type of humidity modification is a major thing. So Phelsuma, which of the Phelsuma is most likely to do well in captivity? Well, the ones that survive basically everywhere and need it only just a little bit above room humidity in order to be happy. So that's like Phelsuma grandis and Phelsuma laticauda. Hey, those are the two that are most popular, right?
I have Florida locale right here.
Yeah. And then you've got the dietary tolerance, those that can survive on a relatively uniform diet, and longevity is another important factor. But if you look across the world at the animals, I think we've done a pretty good job of choosing ones that suit these criteria. There are probably others that you could look at this whole thing from a commercial perspective and be like, well, that one could be exploited to a greater extent. But for the most part, I think those are. And by the way, the other big factor is overall appeal of the animal, right? Because anybody could keep Podarcis in their home, right? Wall lizards. But who wants to keep Podarcis in their home? Like, they're established in New York. They got out. They're established there.
All of Long Island. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
I think they're super cool. Give me a Podarcis any day over a Pogona. Any day.
Well,
yeah, but
I mean,
I think for most of
and
most hobbyists, they're too small. They're not doing the kind of exciting things that you see from bearded dragons. They don't have that outlandish appearance that you see in some of these animals. Like a leopard gecko looks weird. And crested geckos.
I think that's a very European-centric way of looking at it.
Well, that's probably true.
Yeah, because for somebody else, looking at a Podarcis might not be like an Australian person would find a Podarcis quite odd.
Pretty boring. Yeah.
I suppose that's
given one of those Podarcis from the Mediterranean Isles that are like bright blue.
I think these. So I go back to saying what I was initially saying is that I think there is a big element of luck with this stuff, of chance, and I've seen it happen because even 10 or 15 years ago, hognose, Western hognoses in the U.S. were seen as like a unremarkable snake that nobody really cares about. You could buy them for $75. Now that people got their hooks into them and they've made all these weird morphs, they're going for $600, $700, $800.
Now, also when they're very difficult to find in the wild.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, we see that this is.
You know when was the last time I saw hognose? A long time ago, and they used to be common. So
yeah.
It's not good.
Rarity probably plays in, especially when it's a quote-unquote local species. Ability to encounter them probably has a role, not only a causative one, but I mean, it's not a simple model, obviously. There's a lot of different factors going in here. I really think that, Ethan, you're definitely right. The pliability of the genetics, the availability of low-hanging things to mess with, and maybe that's what people are coming up against with crested geckos. Like, the genetics are just not as nice and easy as they'd like them to be. The same is true with chameleons, the panther chameleons. Like, people are breeding for locales, but when you mix locales, you get mud because there's something pure about the different lineages. And if you mix them, you get just shit. So chameleon genetics, other than piebald forms in veiled chameleons, have been totally unrewarding so far. So
I think there's one pied crested gecko that the guy from Pangea owns, and it's like, that's it. That's all they've ever made. And it's
really? Correct me if I'm wrong. Don't they do that also with dart frogs? Like they mix some locales to create certain.
Yeah. There's all kinds of fun things going on.
You want to get a bunch of people really mad at you? Go on to one of the frog forums and be like, I put a bunch of Aratus in with some tinks and.
Yep. Yeah, I mean that will. And people are doing that in chameleon communities as well. They're intentionally trying to cross different locales to see what comes out. And then, I think the important thing, if you're going to do that, which fine, whatever. As long as it's clearly disclaimed in the descendants, then because people can make an informed choice. But what might be happening is people are like crossing and then not telling people, and then you're muddying things. Right. Part of the problem with the chameleons is like you have no idea where the female comes from. You have no idea, so you don't even know if you're muddying up the genetics of those things because they don't come out with accurate enough locality information.
Yeah, you're seeing that with Leachianuses now too.
Exactly. Yeah. And also I would add that for Leachianus, a lot of the things that were being claimed as one locality is just bullshit. They're not from that locality, or that locality doesn't have an appearance, and therefore there's nothing to breed for.
I've been saying the dead giveaway with that one is ask anybody, just show them a random picture of a Leachianus and be like, what locality is this?
Yeah. Not so for instance, panther chameleons, which are like by color, they're color coded
Distinctive.
by location.
I must say
and
that
it makes a rainbow. So
I must say that I've seen the same with constrictor boas. With boa constrictors, like they have messed up localities, and the problem with that is that they are different species. They're not even
they
the
are
same
really
species.
different species. Yeah.
So
Yeah. It causes all manner of problems. So
Yes.
that's a PSA. Please try to get better information from the importers of your animals, because it is extremely important to know where those animals came from for the sake of the pet trade. It can change the species, it can change the genetics, population and location matters.
You're talking
Any
about
final
people. You're talking
words?
about people who label things as like assorted.
I
Or,
know.
SSP.
Or who fail to overtake taxonomic changes 40 years after they happen, which,
Yeah.
alas.
Anyway, final thoughts are just I love my beardy as a pet. I think they are an important part of the like you guys have said, the outreach side of things, the reptile outreach stuff. I don't see myself ever breeding them or anything like that. The space concerns are too big.
Sure.
I have a small one, and I it's not like it's not a monitor where you would need a room, but it's still big enough that one is enough. So.
But as a gateway, what an incredible animal, a great
Yeah.
ambassador for our community. And I'm sure that we have quite a few listeners who are, who might even have come to the community via having a bearded dragon in their home, or seeing one in a pet store, or seeing one in a zoo or something. So
and you're all terribly boring people. I'm joking.
To you, please consider Gabriel to be nothing but a nuisance. Hopefully you enjoy our content on other shows. This one was not for him. But however you found us, however you found the community, we are happy that you're here. You should feel welcome. And so I think with that, we can wrap up the show. Ethan, where can one find out more about you and your crazy life in the world of the internet?
You know what? You can find me on my ethankosak.com.
Did the Ethan's Underlog blog? What happened there?
I have that as well. I just have to be better about updating it.
Okay.
And, yeah. But yes,
EthanKosak.com.
EthanKosak.com, mossyunderlog.blog. Any of those work. You can find me.
All the things.
Yeah.
Hira, what about you?
I'm at Carol's Hive on Instagram and at Carol Knight everywhere else.
And Gabriel?
I'm at Serpent Illus on Instagram and Blue Sky and Twitter and everywhere else, and GabrielLugetto.com also.
We almost just watched Ethan's bearded dragon get eaten by a cat. So
No, you know what's funny is that those two love each other. They will sit at the cage. She wasn't in danger. That's Jonesy, and they will sit at the glass and paw at each other. They have like a Romeo and Juliet thing going on. So
amazing. We'll take your word for it. You can find me at Mark Scherz, MarkScherz, all over the internet. You can follow the podcast all over the place at SquaMates Pod. You can see a video of our beautiful faces and of the charming bearded dragon and also of the cat over at youtube.com/@SquaMatesPod. You can send us questions and inquiries on social media, but also by email, SquaMatesPod@gmail.com. You could go to our website, SquaMatesPod.com, and you can find all kinds of show notes, pictures, references, etc., backlog, and you can follow us everywhere that you find podcasts on the internet, although mostly on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify. You can leave a review wherever you do that, especially over at Apple Podcasts. That's very helpful. It helps more people come to the show. And finally, as we say on the show, Hakuna Squamata.